The supermarket on Creston Street smelled like floor wax and overripe bananas, the kind of scent that stuck in the back of your throat and refused to let go. It was late, close to 9 in the evening, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed with that particular exhausted frequency they only seemed to find after hours, like even the electricity wanted to clock out. I pushed my cart past the cereal aisle, past the end cap of discounted granola bars, and turned the corner into aisle 7 without paying attention to who else might be standing there. I should have paid attention. My name is Pedro Gates, and up until that Wednesday evening in late autumn, I believed my life had achieved a kind of organized mediocrity I could live with indefinitely. I had a clean apartment, a stable job as a freelance audio engineer, a set of reliable routines, and absolutely no one waiting for me when I came home. That last part I had stopped thinking about, or at least I had gotten very good at pretending I had stopped thinking about it. The reason I was in aisle 7 at 9 in the evening was not complicated. My sister Camille had called 3 hours earlier, her voice stretched thin across the line, the baby wailing in the background with that particular full-throated rage that only newborns and alarm clocks can manage. "Pedro, please," she had said. "I'm out of formula. Marcus is gone to his work thing, and I cannot leave the baby, and I cannot listen to her cry anymore." So there I was. Baby formula. Brand name Camille had texted me in all caps with 3 exclamation points. I found the right section of aisle 7, infant nutrition. A stretch of shelf space padded out with pastel-colored tins and soft-focus photographs of smiling infants, and began scanning the labels with the focused desperation of a man who had never once purchased baby formula in his life. The tins all looked the same to me, same cylindrical shape, same optimistic font. I picked one up, read the label, put it back, picked up another. Was this the sensitive formula or the regular? Camille's text said, sensitive. I found the word on a label and turned it over, looking for the number she'd mentioned, and that was when I heard the voice. That one's good. But if she's under 3 months, the stage 1 version is better. I turned. The man standing at the other end of the aisle was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that made the surrounding shelving look slightly abbreviated. He wore a charcoal Henley with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, dark trousers, boots that were practical rather than fashionable. He was holding a basket in one hand with what appeared to be a carton of orange juice, a bag of rice, and 2 cans of soup inside it. His hair was dark and slightly overgrown, the kind of length that suggested he'd meant to cut it 2 weeks ago and hadn't gotten around to it. His face was. I registered this in a rush like a wave of warm water catching me off guard. Very handsome in a way that was quiet and specific, not the kind of handsome that announced itself, but the kind you kept looking at and finding something new. He had a small, neat scar through his left eyebrow. His eyes were dark brown. He was watching me with the patient, unhurried expression of someone who had just offered help without attaching any agenda to it. I looked at the tin in my hand. I looked at him. Stage 1, I repeated, because my brain had decided that was the appropriate response, a faint curve at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than a smile. Second shelf from the bottom. The one with the blue lid. I found it. Blue lid, stage 1, the right brand. I put it in my cart and spent approximately 3 full seconds trying to think of something natural to say, which is about 2.5 seconds longer than it should take a grown adult to manage. My sister's baby, I said finally. I don't have a baby. The corner of his mouth curved again. I figured. How'd you figure? He glanced at my cart. Half a loaf of sourdough bread, a bottle of pasta sauce, some coffee, and a single avocado. Shopping for one, he said simply. People with babies don't look that calm in this aisle. I looked at him. He looked at me. The fluorescent light buzzed. Oliver, he said, and held out the hand that wasn't occupied with the basket. Pedro, I said, and shook it. His grip was firm and brief. His hand was warm. I noticed that too, which was not helpful information for my continued composure. We talked for 4 minutes in that aisle. I know it was 4 minutes because I checked my watch afterward, in the parking lot while loading the formula into the back of my car, as if I needed evidence of what had just happened. He told me his niece was 3 months old and his brother, who lived on the same street as the supermarket, was always running out of formula too. He said it with a kind of fond exasperation that suggested he'd made this exact errand before. I told him about Camille and the wailing and the all-caps text. He made a sound that was half laugh, half commiseration. Then his phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, and I watched the small casual lightness in his face settle back into something more neutral. "I should go," he said. "My brother's waiting." "Right, me too." He picked up his basket from where he'd rested it on the shelf's edge and gave me one more of those restrained, not quite smiles, and walked to the end of the aisle and turned the corner and was gone. And I stood there in aisle 7 for another 30 seconds, holding my cart, before I picked up the baby formula and went to pay. I drove to Camille's apartment and handed over the tin and spent 15 minutes in her kitchen while she fed the baby, the two of us talking in the low voices people use around sleeping things. Even when the thing in question is still awake and making small snuffling sounds. "You look weird," Camille said, not looking up from the baby's face. "I look normal." "You look like something happened." "Nothing happened. I bought formula." "Pedro." She glanced up, brief and assessing. She had always been able to read me in the way that only people who have known you since you were small can manage. "What happened in the supermarket? I met a guy in the formula aisle. He knew which kind to buy. I thanked him and left." Camille's eyes went back to the baby, but the corner of her mouth did something. "Don't," I told her. "I didn't say anything. You were about to say something." "I was going to say that's sweet." She adjusted the baby's head with the practiced ease of someone 3 months into a new and all-consuming skill. "Did you get his number?" I had not gotten his number. I did not say this out loud because I already knew exactly what expression she would make. "His name was Oliver," I said instead. Camille made the expression anyway, without even needing the information. I did not expect to see him again. That was not pessimism. It was just the realistic calculus of two strangers in a large enough city. There are 7 supermarkets within reasonable distance of where I live, and people don't tend to orbit the same one unless their routines specifically pull them there. I thought about him once the next morning, over coffee, in the abstract way you think about a good conversation you'll probably never finish. Then I went to work. I do most of my work from home. Audio engineering for podcasts, some corporate video work, the occasional music project when someone with a budget finds me through recommendation. It is solitary and detailed work that suits me in a way I've spent years refusing to examine too closely. I put on headphones, I listen, I fix things that other people's ears have stopped noticing. There's a satisfaction in that, in hearing what's wrong and knowing how to correct it. 3 days after the supermarket, I took my laptop to a coffee shop 2 streets from my apartment because the building's boiler had decided to go theatrical and my radiators were making sounds like a percussion ensemble. The coffee shop was called Hallow, small and narrow and warm, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and the particular ambient noise of a dozen people working quietly in proximity to each other. I set up in the corner by the window and had been working for approximately 90 minutes when the rain started. Not the gentle city drizzle I was used to. Proper, sudden, diagonal rain that arrived without warning and immediately soaked anyone unlucky enough to be outside. I watched a woman sprint past the window with a tote bag held over her head. I watched a man in a suit go very still on the pavement and then very deliberately start walking as though the rain were beneath his notice. Then the door of the coffee shop opened and Oliver Hood walked in, his hair wet and his Henley darkened at the shoulders, shaking water off his hand and looking mildly annoyed in the way of someone who'd been caught in something they'd intended to outrun. He looked up. He looked at me. I had a moment of pure, unhelpful physical awareness, the kind your body delivers before your thinking brain has a chance to weigh in. Then my thinking brain caught up and produced the observation that this was probably a coincidence and I should not make it strange. He crossed the room to my table. "Aisle 7, he said. "Aisle 7, I agreed. "Your niece okay?" Better than fine. She started smiling at things. He said this with an expression that was so unguarded and warm that it momentarily reorganized my entire impression of his face. Are you working? Finishing a project. It's due this afternoon. He glanced at the empty chair across from me, which was not a question exactly, but had the shape of one. And because I had apparently decided to be a different, braver version of myself since the supermarket, I said, I can talk while I work, if you want to sit down. He sat down. He ordered black coffee and a sandwich he didn't end up eating half of because we kept talking. I did finish my project. I sent the files at 2047 p.m. while he was mid-sentence about something his brother had said, and I held up one finger in the universal request for 30 seconds. And he stopped talking without being offended, and I hit send and closed the laptop. Sorry, I said. Don't apologize for doing your job. He said it simply, not as a rebuke, not as flattery, just as a statement of reasonable expectation. I found it unexpectedly disarming. We stayed in the coffee shop for another 2 hours. The rain continued for most of it. By the time it eased, I knew that he was 34, 2 years older than me, that he worked in structural project management, that he had moved to this part of the city 8 months ago, following a job transfer, that he had one brother and no current partner, and that he had a specific and quietly passionate opinion about the superiority of properly made audio equipment over wireless convenience. That last part made me laugh genuinely and without warning, and something shifted in his expression when I did. Not quite smile, but something more open than that. As if the laugh had gotten past a layer of whatever measured composure he generally wore. What's funny? He asked, but not defensively. I'm an audio engineer. You just said the exact right thing to make me want to keep talking to you forever. There was a pause. Very brief, a single breath of pause, and then he said, good. Just that, good. We exchanged numbers at the door of the coffee shop, standing under the small awning while the last of the rain softened to a mist. There was a moment where neither of us moved, the kind of moment that has a specific weight to it, where you're both aware of the edge of something without being ready to step off it. I'll text you, he said. Okay, I said. He walked away, and I stood on the pavement in the gray afternoon light and felt something that I had spent a considerable amount of time training myself not to feel. Specifically, the particular warmth of wanting something, and not being certain yet whether it was going to hurt. He texted that evening. Just a sentence. Found the audio equipment argument online. You're right, and I'm annoyed about it. I sat on my couch and read it 3 times, and then wrote back, I'll try not to be smug. He responded, you don't seem the smug type. See. Then, after a moment, though I've only seen you in 2 places, so I'm working with limited data. I said, I'm extremely humble in all other contexts. Hi, he said, I'll hold you to that. What I should explain, what becomes relevant as this story moves forward, is what I was carrying when I walked into that supermarket, when I sat down in that coffee shop. When I started answering those texts with the careful, measured enthusiasm of someone who has learned to ration hope. I had been in 2 serious relationships before Oliver. The first, at 26, lasted 3 years and ended when my partner decided the city was wrong for him, and the relationship was also by extension wrong, and moved somewhere warm with the particular cheerful decisiveness of someone who had made peace with a difficult choice before they announced it. There was no cruelty in it. That was almost worse. The second relationship lasted 18 months and ended because I was apparently too careful, too measured, too restrained, and my partner at the time found someone who gave more easily, more freely. And I couldn't fault him for it, but the ending sat in me like a splinter for a long time after. After the second one, I built my organized mediocrity with intention. Routines, work, my sister's baby, and the dinners I cooked for myself, and the evenings with headphones on, listening for what was wrong and fixing it. It was not an unhappy life, but it was a life with a sealed room in it, and I had put the key somewhere deliberately difficult to find. Oliver did not ask about any of this right away. He was not the kind of person who extracted information. He created space where it could arrive on its own timetable. We started meeting once a week, then more often. Coffee that became lunch, that became long dinners, at whichever restaurant neither of us had tried yet. We talked about our work, our families, our opinions on things that mattered to us, and gradually the more layered things began to surface, not as confessions, but as the natural consequence of two people paying attention to each other. About 3 weeks into this, I am deliberately resisting the word courtship, but it was courtship, he asked me, over a shared plate of something I can't now remember, what I was afraid of. Not in the context of anything, just, what are you afraid of? I looked at him. Why? Because I want to know. Straightforward. Straightforward. No agenda I could detect, just the plain directness he seemed to move through the world with. You don't have to answer. I thought about it seriously, wanting something and finding out I was wrong about it. He was quiet for a moment. Wrong about what part of it? Whether it wanted me back. He picked up his glass, drank, set it down. His eyes hadn't moved from my face. That's a reasonable fear. What are you afraid of? I asked. Being too much for someone, he said, without hesitating, and then changing myself to be less and losing the thread of who I actually am. We sat with that for a moment, the two confessions sitting on the table between us like objects we'd each placed there carefully, waiting to see what the other did with them. You don't seem like too much to me, I said. The not-quite smile appeared. Then it became something fuller. You don't seem like someone who'd be wrong about what he wants. The word came up the way words sometimes do, sideways, in the middle of something else. We had been seeing each other for 6 weeks, when I met his brother Danny, who opened his front door, looked at me and said, "Oh good, he found someone," with the absolute lack of filter that close siblings reserve for each other. Oliver, standing behind me, made a sound that suggested this was not the first time Danny had done something like this and would not be the last. Danny's partner was a warm, decisive woman named Rosa, who had the particular quality of making everyone in a room feel immediately at ease. Their daughter, Oliver's niece, the 3-month-old, now 4 months and recently determined to be an expert smiler, was passed to me within 20 minutes because Danny decided empirically that I seemed like someone who knew what to do with a baby, which was not true, but seemed rude to argue. The baby examined my face with the focused, slightly cross-eyed intensity of infants everywhere. I held her carefully and made the sounds adults make when they have no idea what they're doing but are attempting confidence. She grabbed my finger with the small, surprising grip of a very small person who has recently discovered that fingers exist and is deeply committed to this new information. Oliver was watching from across the room. He had the same warm, unguarded expression I'd seen the first time he mentioned her smile, something that didn't belong to the measured composure he usually wore, something underneath it. "He's a natural," Rosa told him. "He's panicking," Oliver said, which was accurate, and the accuracy of it. The fact that he could see it, that he was watching with enough attention to see it, did something to the sealed room inside me, not opened it. But the key was somewhere slightly closer to hand. Later, Danny and Rosa put the baby to bed, and the 4 of us sat in the kitchen with wine, and the conversation drifted the way kitchen conversations do. And at some point, Danny said something about Oliver that I didn't fully catch. A reference to something, a word, a way of framing, and Rosa laughed and said, "Classic alpha behavior," in a tone that was fond and gently teasing. Oliver's jaw moved in the slight way it did when he was suppressing something. "You don't have to call it that." "That's literally what it is," Danny said, with the comfortable authority of a younger sibling who has spent years refining exactly which observations make their older brother least comfortable. I looked at Oliver. He looked at me. Something moved in his expression, a brief calculation, and then he said, quietly and without deflection, "We can talk about it." We drove home separately. His apartment was in the opposite direction from mine, and he texted when he got home. That was bad timing for that conversation to start. I wrote back, "I don't mind. Whenever you want." He wrote, "Tomorrow?" HB8. I said, "Whenever." 3 minutes passed. Then, "Can I come to yours?" HKBB. He came the next evening. I made coffee because it was something to do with my hands. and he sat on the other side of my kitchen counter and accepted a cup and looked at it for a moment in that way he had of gathering himself before he said something that mattered to him. "I'm an alpha," he said. In the way that word tends to mean in the context of how people are wired. I don't mean it as a personality type. I understood what he meant. It's something that exists in the world without a lot of clean consensus about how to talk about it. People who carry a particular kind of instinct, a pull toward certain dynamics, something harder to name than mere personality. I knew it existed. I had never thought particularly carefully about where I fell. "Okay," I said. He looked at me. "That's it? I'm trying to understand what you're telling me. What does it mean for you specifically?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "It means I have to pay attention to myself. Because the impulse is not controlling, that's not the right word. It's more like," he stopped, tried again. "I feel things about the people I care about very strongly. I want to protect them. I want to know they're safe and taken care of. And if I'm not careful about it, that can tip into something that doesn't leave room for the other person." "The too much thing," I said. He looked at me steadily. "Yes. So you've managed it in past relationships." "I've tried." A pause. "Not always successfully." I thought about what he'd said weeks earlier, about changing himself to be less and losing the thread of who he was. I thought about it differently now, with this new information as context, and I understood it in a way I hadn't quite before. "What happened?" I asked, not to press, but because I wanted the honest version. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "The person before last." I overwhelmed her. Not intentionally. She said it felt like being under surveillance, even though I thought I was just paying attention. I heard that and tried to scale back. "The person after that." A short silence. I scaled back so much she thought I didn't care. And she was right that something had been lost, but I didn't know how to get it back without going too far the other way. "So you've been trying to find the calibration," I said. "Something like that." His eyes met mine. "I'm telling you this because I need you to know what you might be signing up for, and because you deserve to be able to make an informed decision." I sat with that for a long moment, the kitchen quiet around us, the coffee cooling in our cups. "Can I tell you something?" I said. He waited. "I've been told I'm too careful, too measured, that I don't give enough." I watched his face. I think the version of me that got into this habit was trying to protect himself from wanting something too much and being wrong about it. And the side effect is that the people I was with felt like I wasn't all the way present. Oliver was very still. "I don't think your too much and my too little are going to destroy each other," I said. "I think they might actually." I stopped because I wasn't sure of the word and I didn't want to use the wrong one. "Fit," he said quietly, like he'd been thinking the same word. I was going to say that, yeah. I want to be honest about what falling in love with Oliver Hood looked like from the inside, because it was not the kind of thing that arrived in a single dramatic moment. It arrived the way light changes, gradually, and then you look around and the room is completely different and you're not sure exactly when it happened, only that it has. It was the texts he sent in the middle of his workday. Not often, not intrusively, but specifically. As if he'd seen something that made him think of me and then actually told me instead of filing it away. A building with interesting structural details. A podcast he thought I'd like. One morning, a photograph of the sky from his office window because, as he put it, the light's doing something strange and you'd probably have words for it that I don't. It was the way he listened when I talked about my work. Not politely, actually. He asked follow-up questions days after conversations, as if he'd been thinking about what I'd said in the interim and arrived at a new point of entry. Nobody had ever done that to me before, held my words carefully between conversations. It was the evening about 8 weeks in when I was on a deadline and stressed in the specific way audio deadlines make me stressed, which is quietly and comprehensively. And he came over without asking with food he'd picked up from the place I'd mentioned once in passing as being good for exactly this kind of night. And he sat in my living room and didn't speak until I emerged from my studio corner 2 hours later looking wrung out, and then he handed me the food and said, "Don't apologize for working." And the relief of that, The specific relief of someone who had simply understood what you needed without needing to be told was almost too much. I started opening the sealed room, not all at once. A door is not a dam. But bit by bit, the things I had trained myself not to reach for, the willingness to say I want this, the capacity to let someone's care for me actually land instead of deflecting it with humor or practicality, began to resurface. I noticed them the way you notice a return of sensation in something that's been numb for a long time, with something between relief and ache. He noticed too. Of course he noticed. This was Oliver, who paid attention the way other people breathe. "You're different," he said one evening, not accusingly. "Different how?" He thought about it. More, a pause, more here. I looked at him. We were sitting on my couch, close but not quite touching, which had become our default geography in recent weeks. Close enough to feel the warmth of each other, not quite close enough to have made the choice. "Yeah," I said, "I am." He turned toward me slightly. The careful composure he wore was doing something complicated, present but not sealed, controlled but not locked. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "Okay. I've been—" He stopped, precise with his words the way he always was. "I've been making a point of not pushing, because I didn't want to be too much before you had a chance to figure out what you wanted." "I know," I said. "I could see you doing that." Something moved in his face. "I appreciated it," I said. "And I want you to know that you don't need to anymore." The breath he let out was very quiet, but I heard it. I had gotten very good at hearing him. He reached out and took my hand, unhurried and deliberate, and held it with the same warm, firm grip from aisle 7, and neither of us moved for a long moment. And the sealed room inside me opened the rest of the way. Not thrown open, gently and with intention. The way you open a window when the air outside has finally, after a long winter, turned warm. Our first kiss happened in the most ordinary possible circumstances, which felt entirely right. We were in his kitchen on a Sunday morning, 4 days after the couch conversation, the first morning I'd stayed over, in his guest room, which neither of us made complicated. He was making eggs, and I was standing at his counter with coffee reading something on my phone, and he turned from the stove and reached past me for the salt. And when he straightened, he was close enough that I could see the specific texture of the scar through his eyebrow. I had thought about kissing him, probably 100 times by then. In all those hundreds of imaginings, it had been an event, arrived at through some declarative moment, some threshold crossed with appropriate gravity. What actually happened was that I put my phone down, turned toward him, and kissed him, simply and without announcement, the way you do something you've been deciding for a long time and have finally decided. He was still for a beat, just a beat, the half-second of absorbing something unexpected. And then he kissed me back with a quiet thoroughness that had been building for weeks, his hand coming up to my jaw in a way that was careful and decided at once, as if he had also been considering this for a long time and was glad the considering was done. When we separated, his eyes were still closed for a moment, then they opened and found mine. "Good morning," he said. I laughed, and the laugh broke something open between us in the best possible way, and he smiled, fully, not the not quite smile, but a real one. The one I'd been cataloging the edges of for weeks, and I thought, there it is, that's the one. The eggs burned. We ate toast instead and didn't care. There is a particular kind of happiness that is difficult to write about honestly, without making it sound slight, because it lives in small things. And small things can read as trivial to someone who hasn't yet discovered that they are the actual material of a life. What I want to describe is the month between our first kiss and Camille's visit, because that month contained the kind of accumulating warmth that is easy to skip over in a story in favor of the dramatic moments. And skipping over it would be dishonest about what actually changed in me. We had breakfast 3 times that week. Not planned. It became a kind of running logic. One of us was usually at the other's apartment by morning, and the other made coffee without being asked, and the morning unfolded. I learned that Oliver read the news the way other people meditate, sitting still with his coffee and working through things methodically. And that he did not talk much for the first 20 minutes, but was not absent. He was there, just quietly there, and that was enough. He learned that I moved around in the morning, not from restlessness, but from some physical need to inhabit space before I could sit down in it, and he let me move without tracking me. Which sounds small, and was immense. He had a playlist he listened to when he was working from home that was entirely without lyrics, instrumental things with long, sustained notes. And the first time I heard it drifting from his home office, I stopped in the hallway for a moment and just listened. And something in me recognized the care with which it had been assembled. Someone who lived with sound the way I did, not just heard it. He had opinions about coffee that were specific and not negotiable. Not pretentious opinions. Practical ones, grounded in what he could taste. He bought good coffee, and he brewed it properly, and he made mine the same way and handed it to me without fanfare. And every time he did, I thought about the people who had made me coffee before and never gotten it right. Not because they hadn't cared, but because they hadn't paid that particular kind of attention. He paid that kind of attention to everything. I started to understand that this was not a strategy for him. It was not a deliberate effort to notice, the way it might have been for someone who'd been told they weren't attentive enough. It was simply how he moved through the world. Oliver Hood moved through the world with the quality of someone who considered most things worth his attention. The structural detail in a building, the way light was doing something particular in a window, the sound of something I was mixing when he was close enough to hear it, the particular quality of my silence when I was tired versus when I was thinking. I asked him once, "Do you ever turn it off?" "Turn what off?" "The noticing." He thought about it genuinely. "Probably when I sleep." "And otherwise?" "It's not effort. It would take more effort to turn it off." I thought about my own experience of attention, the way I put it into work, into sound, into the detailed invisible craft of making things heard the right way, the way I had trained it away from other people for years, telling myself it was self-preservation and not naming what I was actually afraid of. "I want to be more like that," I said. He looked at me. "You already are, when you let yourself." I was quiet for a moment. What do I look like when I'm not letting myself? He turned toward me, thoughtful, like someone standing at a window, he said, looking out at something good and not walking outside. I thought about that for a long time. The night before Camille's visit, I stood in my kitchen and cooked something that took longer than it needed to because I wanted to make it well. Oliver was in the next room reviewing something for work, and I could hear the quiet sounds of his presence, the occasional shift, the low sound he made when he found something interesting, and I stood at the stove and felt fully and without deflection that I was happy. Not the careful, measured contentment I had trained myself to call happiness, the real thing. The kind that doesn't announce itself as extraordinary but simply is. Oliver appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Smells good." 20 more minutes. He crossed the kitchen and leaned against the counter beside me, close enough that his arm rested against mine. He looked at the pot, not at me, in the easy way of two people comfortable in a shared space. "You cook the same way you mix audio," he said. I looked at him. "What does that mean?" "Careful, very specific, like there's a version in your head you're trying to match." A pause. "And when it gets close to right, you relax slightly. I can see it." I thought about this. It was accurate. "Is that annoying?" I asked. "No." He said it simply. "It's how you are." "I like how you are." I kept stirring. His arm stayed against mine. The kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of whatever I was making, and outside the evening was arriving in the particular quiet way. Autumn evenings arrived in this city, without drama, slowly. The light fading to something amber and then gray. And it was just us and the ordinary evening, and neither of us needed it to be anything else. My sister had the specific quality of someone who had been waiting patiently to say, "I told you so," without having technically told me anything, and who was determined to enjoy the moment fully when it arrived. She arrived at my apartment on a Saturday, 6 weeks after the kitchen morning, the baby in the carrier on her chest, Marcus trailing behind with the bag that now seemed to accompany their every movement like an expedition pack. I had told her about Oliver. I had told her carefully and selectively, which meant she knew almost everything because she was my sister and could read the gaps. She walked in, looked at me, and said, "You look like a person who is being taken care of." I was about to object on the grounds that I was fully capable of taking care of myself when Oliver came out of the kitchen holding the spatula he'd been using for the lunch I had told him he didn't need to make and which he had insisted on making anyway. Camille looked at him. She looked at me. She looked at the spatula. "Oh," she said, with the weight of a complete sentence. Marcus shook Oliver's hand with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who was simply glad his wife's brother seemed happy, and Camille handed me the baby without breaking eye contact with me, which I chose to interpret as a meaningful compliment. And Oliver watched all of this with the restrained amusement he defaulted to when my family dynamics were on display. Later, while Marcus took the baby for a walk around the block and Oliver was briefly in the other room, Camille sat across from me at my own kitchen table and looked at me the way she had looked at me since we were children, direct and without mercy. "He's the real one," she said. I didn't argue. "You know that." "Yes." She leaned forward slightly. "Then don't be careful, Pedro. Not this time. Let him actually in. I'm working on it. Work faster." "Eh?" Oliver came back into the kitchen, and she switched seamlessly to complimenting his lunch preparation, and I sat at my kitchen table and thought about what she'd said, and felt the last remnants of the careful architecture I'd built around myself showing its seams. I would be dishonest if I pretended there was no difficulty. That would be the wrong kind of story, the kind that treats love as uncomplicated because difficulty makes it feel less romantic, which is backwards. The difficulty is the proof of it. The difficulty arrived in month 4, which is the month things get real because the honeymoon of newness has worn enough that you start encountering the actual edges of each other. Oliver's pull toward protection, the alpha instinct he described with such careful honesty, expressed itself one evening in a way that neither of us handled perfectly. I had a meeting with a client that had gone badly. The kind of badly where someone questions your professional competence in a way that is specific enough to sting and vague enough that you can't directly address it. I came home frustrated and coiled, needing time to decompress the way I always needed time to decompress, which was quietly, with music and solitude and my own particular process for coming back to myself. Oliver was already at my place. We'd been freely using each other's keys for 2 weeks by then, and he read my state the moment I walked in the door. I could see him do it, and I watched him decide to act on what he'd read, which meant by the time I had set down my bag, he was in the kitchen getting me tea and asking what had happened. And I, who was not ready, who needed 30 minutes of quiet before I could even speak about it coherently, said something sharp and deflecting that I regret. Not cruel, but closed. He went quiet. Not hurt, quiet. Processing, quiet. He put the tea on the counter and stepped back in a way that was giving me space, but that I, in my frayed state, read as withdrawal. So I said, even more stupidly, "You don't have to fix everything." The pause that followed had a texture. "I know I don't," he said. His voice was controlled. "I was making tea. You were doing the thing." "What thing?" The reading me and responding to it before I've even had a chance to." I stopped because I could hear how it sounded. I could hear the uncharitableness of it. He was very still. "I'm going to go for a walk," he said. "Oliver, I'll be back in half an hour. The tea is there." He left, and I sat in my apartment alone with the tea cooling on the counter. And I spent 20 of those 30 minutes in the particular internal experience of someone who has just done a thing they already regret and is watching themselves do it anyway in recent memory. He came back in 32 minutes. I was in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway. "I'm sorry," I said. "That was unfair." He looked at me steadily. "You weren't wrong that I was doing the thing, but the thing is not bad in itself. I was paying attention to you and wanted to take care of you. You were allowed to not want that in that moment. You weren't allowed to make me feel like the instinct itself was wrong." I sat with that. "You're right," I said. He came into the kitchen, leaned against the counter, arms crossed but not closed. I should have asked, "Do you want to talk? Or do you need time first?" That's a question I can ask, I assumed. "That's also right." We looked at each other. "We're going to have to keep doing this," he said, saying the actual thing. "I know." I reached out and touched his arm, the first contact, deliberate, I'm bad at it. I'm trying to get better. He unfolded his arms, and his hand covered mine on his forearm. You're better than you think. We stood in the kitchen until the tea went completely cold, and then he made new tea, and I told him about the client meeting, and he listened the whole way through without fixing anything. Just listening. And when I was done, he said, "That sounds genuinely frustrating," with the simple accuracy of someone who had heard all of it and understood. And that was all I needed. I just hadn't known how to ask for it. The repair of the kitchen evening was not instant. It rarely is with real things. What I mean is that we talked and we said the right things and we understood each other, and then we had to go to bed and sleep and wake up and discover whether the understanding had held overnight, which is the actual test of repair and not the moment of talking itself. It had held, but I woke with the lingering residue of it, the slight soreness that follows an honest conversation where neither person came away without some acknowledgement of their own failure. I lay in the gray of early morning and felt the weight of what I'd said the evening before, the sharpness of it, the unfairness, and felt something that was part guilt and part recognition. Oliver was awake beside me. I could tell by his breathing. He didn't speak, which was his way. He waited and let the morning have its say. I've been doing that for years, I said, the shutting out. When I'm not ready. He waited. I used it as a way to stay in control of when I was allowed to be affected by things. If I controlled the access, I couldn't be caught off guard. I looked at the ceiling, which meant I also couldn't be surprised by the good things. Oliver turned his head toward me. His face in the early gray light was quiet and open. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, not critically, but genuinely. "Because last night was the first time I've done it to you," I said. "And I don't want it to become something I just do to you. That's one of the things that ended the last relationship. Not one incident. A pattern." He was quiet for a moment, processing, giving it the weight it was due. That was him. He didn't rush to reassure, he heard the actual thing first. "What would help," he said finally, "when you're in that state? If you asked, instead of reading and responding, if you asked first, do you need space or do you want contact? I can do that. And if I say space, I mean 30 minutes, not an hour, not the evening, 30 minutes, and then I come back to you." Okay, that's what I needed to say. I turned my head toward him, and what I needed was to say it without it being another deflection. Just, "This is true about me. This is what I need." He looked at me for a long moment in the gray light, and I watched the thing in his face that was always at work behind his eyes. That careful processing, that attention, arrive at something. "I told you that you were more here," he said quietly. "Yeah. That's what I meant, that right there." I held his gaze. He reached out, unhurried, and tucked a piece of my hair back that wasn't really in the way, just a touch, just contact, just, "I'm here," and I let it land. 30 minutes, he repeated. "And then you come back to me." "Every time," I said. 3 months into us, I woke up at 2 in the morning with the specific sourceless anxiety that sometimes visits at that hour. The kind that has no object, that simply settles on your chest like a weight and refuses to explain itself. Oliver was asleep beside me. He had one arm flung back, face turned slightly toward me, the architecture of his sleeping face more open than his waking one, the way faces tend to be when they're not performing anything for anyone. The scar through his eyebrow caught a faint stripe of light from the window. I watched him for a while, not with any particular thought, just watching, the way you look at something you're glad is there. After a while, his eyes opened. Just opened, without the usual progression of waking. One moment asleep, the next looking at me in the low dark. "You're awake," he said, slightly rough with sleep. "Yeah. Something wrong?" "No. Just awake." He turned fully toward me. In the dark, with the unguarded quality that 2 in the morning has, he looked at me for a long moment without speaking. "The anxiety thing?" he said. He'd learned about the 2 a.m. visits. He hadn't tried to solve them. He'd asked what helped, and I told him it was usually just being near something that felt steady, and he had received that information with the simplicity of someone who'd simply file it away until needed. "Yeah," I said. He reached out and put a hand on my shoulder, not pulling me in, not solving it, just there, steady. The way he'd said he'd be. "Go back to sleep," he said. "I'm here." And I did. It was that simple and that not simple. I closed my eyes with his hand on my shoulder, and the sourceless anxiety retreated the way fog retreats from a specific warmth, and I slept. I thought, in the last moment before I went under, I love him. I hadn't said it yet. I'd been building toward it the way you build toward anything that matters, carefully, wanting to be sure I was saying it because it was true and not because I was afraid of the saying. But there in the dark, with his hand on my shoulder and the steady sound of his breathing, I knew it was true. And I decided I would say it. I said it on a Thursday evening, which is possibly the most ordinary evening of the week, and therefore, I think, exactly right. We had been at a small concert. A friend of mine played in a band and had invited us. And we'd stood in the back of a small venue with drinks we barely touched because the music was actually good and deserved full attention. Oliver had stood close to me, and at some point his hand had found mine in the way that had become natural, neither of us marking it, just present. Walking home after through the kind of autumn evening that makes cities look their best, cool air, wet pavement, the amber of streetlights. I felt it the way I had at 2 a.m, clear and unambiguous. "This is true. I love you," I said. We were walking. He stopped. I stopped and turned. He was looking at me with an expression that was the opposite of his composed default. Something open and lit and almost undone. As if he'd been waiting for this with more feeling than his usual careful management had fully contained. "Pedro." My name in his voice with that much weight in it was its own declaration. "You don't have to say it back right now," I said, not as a caveat but as information, wanting him to know it was offered freely. "I just wanted you to know." "I love you," he said. "I have for a while. I was waiting until you were ready to hear it." We stood on the pavement in the autumn evening with the streetlight amber around us, and he took my face in both hands and kissed me in a way that had nothing measured about it. Nothing restrained. Nothing held back. Just all the warmth I'd been finding pieces of for months given in full. I kissed him back with everything I'd unlocked. 6 months after aisle 7, I was in his apartment on a Sunday morning. My coffee mug lived in his cabinet now, and his spare key lived on my keyring. And this felt not like encroachment, but like the natural consequence of two people who were building something. And I was watching him read at the other end of the couch, his feet near mine. His hair still yesterday's disheveled, and I thought about the person I'd been in that supermarket standing in front of the formula tins alone and carefully settled in my mediocrity. I thought about how close I'd come to not saying anything in aisle 7, to thanking him for the formula recommendation and walking away without introducing myself. He looked up from his book, found my eyes. Something registered in his face. The particular attention he aimed at me when he thought I was having a thought worth knowing. "What?" he said. "I was just thinking about the supermarket." He bookmarked his page. Aisle 7. "You told me which formula to buy." The stage 1. Blue lid. The corner of his mouth curved. "Are you sentimental about aisle 7? "A little," I admitted. He reached out without moving from his spot and took my ankle, a light hold, present and warm. "Good sentimental or bad sentimental?" "Good," I said, "extremely good. The kind where I'm grateful I happened to be standing in the wrong aisle at the right time." He looked at me in the soft morning light of his apartment. This man who was too much and not enough and exactly right. Who paid attention like it was a practice and held the things I told him carefully and made tea when I was tired and stood steady in the dark at 2 a.m. And the not quite smile became the real one. The full one. The one I'd been cataloging since a rainy afternoon in a coffee shop. "Wrong aisle," he said. Right time, I agreed. Outside, the autumn light was doing something. I would have words for it that he didn't, and he would wait while I found them, and that was us, that was what we had built, me finding words for things, and him making the space where the words could arrive. I leaned forward and kissed the corner of his jaw, and he turned his face slightly toward me, an invitation. And I kissed him properly, and he kissed me back, and his book fell to the floor, and neither of us picked it up for a very long time. A year after the first time, we went back. Not deliberately, or at least, that was the story I told myself, until Oliver, standing in the produce section, said quietly, "We're about to pass aisle 7, with the calm of someone pointing out a landmark." So it was deliberate, or at least mutual. We turned the corner into the infant nutrition aisle together. The same fluorescent light, the same faint buzz, the same array of pastel tins with the optimistic fonts. I stopped in the spot where I'd been standing, and Oliver stopped a few feet away from where he'd been standing, and we looked at each other across the ground between. He was still tall. He still had the scar. He was wearing a different Henley, burgundy, not charcoal, and he was not carrying a basket, because we were sharing a cart now, as we shared most things. "Here we are," I said. "Here we are." He crossed a few feet, unhurried, and stood next to me, his shoulder against mine, warm and solid. "Stage 1, he said. "Blue lid. I never bought it again. Your sister's daughter is 1.5. She's off formula? She is." Camille's daughter could now smile and pull herself up on furniture and say 3 words with remarkable conviction, and had recently discovered that dropping things from heights was an interesting experiment, which kept everyone in proximity in a state of alert. Oliver looked at the formula tins and then at me, and I looked at him, and the fluorescent light buzzed above us the way it had buzzed a year ago when I was alone, and he was a stranger, and neither of us knew what the other would become. "I'm glad you were here," I said. He put his arm around my shoulders, easy and unhesitating. "I'm glad you were here." We stood in aisle 7 for a moment longer, the two of us and the year between those 2 moments and everything that had happened in it, the coffee shop and the rain, the kitchen confessions, the 2 a.m., dark, the Thursday pavement, the Sunday mornings and the arguments and the repairings, and the ways we'd learned each other's actual shapes instead of the shapes we'd initially imagined. Then we moved on together toward the rest of the store and the rest of the evening and all the ordinary Sundays that were, I understood now, the actual substance of a life, not the dramatic moments, but the accumulated weight of small chosen ordinary things. The fluorescent light buzzed behind us as we went. I didn't look back. I had everything I needed in the direction I was moving. A year is a measurement. It sounds clean from the outside. A full rotation, a return to the same point, a tidy narrative arc. From the inside, it is not clean. It is made of Wednesday evenings and Sunday mornings and late-night conversations that begin about one thing and end somewhere entirely different. It is made of arguments and the repairs of small victories and smaller embarrassments of the steady accumulation of knowing a person, not their curated self, but their actual self, with its specific textures and rhythms and the ways they fail and come back and fail again in slightly different ways. I know Oliver's actual self now. I know that he wakes up faster than he falls asleep, which is to say he comes out of sleep abruptly and is almost immediately present. While going in, he drifts gradually and sometimes starts talking about something and doesn't finish the thought. I know that he is more patient with strangers than with people he loves, not from indifference to those he loves, but from the opposite. He holds them to a higher standard of honesty and is less willing to let things slide. I know that he has a specific and slightly baffling affection for Map's physical ones, that he keeps folded in the side pocket of whatever bag he's carrying, and that he has never once, in the time I've known him, used one because he also has excellent spatial memory. But the maps comfort him in some way he has explained twice, and I have not fully understood and don't need to. I know that he finds the first day after a finished project difficult. Not the finishing, but the day after, when the sense of purpose deflates and the next thing hasn't yet arrived. I know he feels that day badly if left to his own devices, choosing things that don't quite satisfy, and that what actually helps is company and something to do with his hands. So now, when I know a project of his is ending, I try to be around the following day. Not ostentatiously, I don't announce it. I'm just there, in his kitchen or mine, with something that needs doing, or a plan that needs making, or a conversation that can fill the gap until the next purpose arrives. He knows things about me too, of course. He knows about the 2 a.m. anxiety and what helps. He knows that I need 30 minutes of quiet after difficult things, and that 30 minutes is actually the number, not more, not less. He knows that I am more sentimental than I let on, that I hold on to small things and carry them longer than I admit. That the organized mediocrity I'd built for myself was never quite as comfortable as I'd made it sound, just the best arrangement I'd found for a solitude I'd decided was fixed. He knows that it was not fixed. He knew that before I did. I think he saw it in aisle 7, not the full picture but the shape of something that could be different, that quality of attention he brought to everything. He looked at a stranger trying to read a formula tin and saw, not just a person in need of a recommendation, but someone in a sealed room who might, with enough patience, open the door. I am glad he waited. I am glad I opened it. This is what I know now. The sealed room was not protection. It was a delay. Love arrives regardless. The only choice is whether to be present when it does, or to stand at the window watching until the light changes and you've missed the warmest part of the afternoon. I stood at that window for a long time. I walked outside. I am still outside. I intend to stay. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.